One second I was sitting at the Thanksgiving table, the next I was standing in the driveway in my socks because I asked my stepfather where my mother's life insurance money went. That's it. That's all I said. And he looked at me across the turkey and the green bean casserole and the rolls my aunt had driven 3 hours to bring, and he said, "Get out of my house." Not our house. His house. That distinction had always mattered to him. I was 28 years old. I hadn't lived there in 6 years. I'd only come back for the holiday because my younger sister, Lily, had called me twice the week before, saying, "Please, just come. It's been so hard since Mom passed, we should try to be a family." So I drove 4 hours from Columbus to this house in rural Indiana that never felt like mine. And I sat down at that table, and I asked one question, and now I was outside in 30-degree weather watching my own breath disappear in the dark. The front door didn't slam. That would have meant he still had some feeling about it. He just closed it quietly, the way you close a cabinet when nothing inside it matters. I stood there for a moment looking at the lit windows. I could see the shapes of people moving inside. My aunt, my uncle, Lily, his kids from his first marriage, all of them rearranging themselves around the space I'd just left, filling it in like water. I didn't have my coat. My keys were on the hook, just inside the door. My phone was at 11%. I walked around to the garage side of the house and sat on the cold concrete step and called the only person I could think of. She didn't pick up. I'd met my biological father's sister exactly once. When I was 11, my mother had a photograph of her, a tall woman in a yellow dress standing in front of what looked like a hotel in a warm place. On the back, in my mother's handwriting, Claudette, Savannah, 1998. I didn't even know if the number I had was still good. I found it in a box of my mother's things after the funeral, written on a folded piece of paper that also had a phone number for a dentist and a reminder to pick up dry cleaning. I typed it into my phone and told myself I'd never use it. I used it now. It went to voicemail, a woman's voice, low and clear. "You've reached Claudette. Leave a message." I said, "This is Elliot. You knew my mother, Catherine. I'm sorry to call out of nowhere. I'm in a situation. You can ignore this." I just didn't know who else to call. I hung up and stared at the strip of pale light under the garage door. My mother had died 8 months earlier. Pancreatic cancer, which is the kind that doesn't give you much warning or time to make things right. She was 53. She'd been married to my stepfather, Dale, for 14 years, and in those 14 years she had, to my knowledge, never once asked him to account for anything. She trusted him completely. She trusted him with her savings account, with the equity she'd built in her house before she met him, with the small inheritance she'd received when her own mother died. She trusted him the way women sometimes trust men who are very confident and very calm, and who make you feel, somehow, that asking questions is the same as causing problems. After she died, I found out the house was mortgaged to the hilt. The savings account had maybe $4,000 in it, and the life insurance policy. A $300,000 policy my mother had taken out when I was born, with me listed as the primary beneficiary, had been changed sometime in the last 3 years to list Dale as the sole beneficiary. He'd already collected it. My mother's attorney told me this over the phone in a flat voice. The way attorneys tell you things they know will devastate you, already bracing for whatever comes next. What came next was me driving 4 hours to Indiana on Thanksgiving. My phone buzzed. A text from the number I called. "I got your message. Are you safe?" I typed back, "Physically, yes. Long story. 3 dots. Then, I'm in Indianapolis for the week. I can be there in 2 hours. Stay where you are." I read that 3 times. I typed, "You don't have to do that." She typed back, "I know." I didn't go back inside. I thought about knocking, asking for my coat, my keys, but I kept thinking about the way Dale had said my house, and I couldn't make myself do it. I found an old moving blanket in the garage. The side door was unlocked, and I wrapped it around my shoulders and sat on the step and waited. At some point, Lily came out. She was wearing her coat and holding mine. "He told me what you said," she said. I asked where the insurance money went. She was quiet. She sat down next to me on the step, which I hadn't expected. "I know," she said finally. "I've been thinking about it too." "He spent it, Lily. $300,000. Mom had that for me. She took out that policy when I was 6 weeks old. I know. She changed it at some point. Or he convinced her to. I don't know which. Lily pulled her sleeves down over her hands. He says she did it willingly, that she wanted to make sure the house was taken care of. The house she doesn't own anymore. She didn't answer. We sat there for a while. The neighborhood was quiet the way only rural places get quiet. Deep, total, like sound itself had gone somewhere warmer. Someone's coming, I said. My father's sister. I haven't seen her since I was a kid. I called her. Lily looked at me. Why? Because I had 11% battery and no coat and nowhere to go. I paused. And because I think she might know something. About our mother. About where some of this money actually went. Lily handed me my coat. She stood up. Be careful, Elliot. She went back inside. Claudette arrived at 10:47 p.m. in a black SUV that looked like it cost more than anything on that street. She was tall, same as in the photograph, with short natural hair and a long wool coat, and she moved the way people move when they are very used to being in charge of things. She looked at me standing in the driveway and her face did something complicated. You look like your father, she said, around the eyes. I didn't know how to respond to that. I hadn't seen my biological father since I was 4. She said, let's not talk out here, get in the car. We sat in the warmth of the running vehicle, and I told her everything. The insurance policy, the mortgage, the $4,000, the Thanksgiving dinner and the driveway. She listened without interrupting, which is a skill most people don't have. She just sat and listened, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Your mother called me, she said, 7 months before she died. I went still. She found out about the insurance policy change. Dale had done it without telling her. She'd signed something, she told me, something buried in the stack of documents he'd put in front of her, told her it was a refinancing disclosure. By the time she realized what it was, she was too sick to fight it the way she wanted to. Claudette paused. She asked me to look after you, to make sure you knew. Knew what? That she didn't do it willingly. She looked at me, and that there's more. I found out that night that my biological father, a man named Thomas, who I'd understood my whole life to have simply disappeared, walked out, wanted nothing to do with us, had not, in fact, disappeared by choice. He had died when I was 7, a car accident in Georgia. He had been, at the time of his death, a partner in a real estate development firm that had, over the following 2 decades, become worth considerably more than anyone expected. He had a will. The will named me. Dale had known about this. Dale had, and this is the part that made me sit very still in that car and breathe very carefully, intercepted the notification from the estate attorney when I was 19. I'd been living with my mother at the time. The letter had come to the house. Dale had opened it, read it, and thrown it away. Claudette had found this out only recently when the firm's remaining partners began the process of formally distributing the remaining assets. Standard procedure, decades later, meant hiring a professional genealogist to locate all living heirs. That genealogist had found me, and when Claudette, who had a stake in the firm's legacy as Thomas's sister, had asked the attorney whether Elliot Haynes had been previously notified, the answer that came back had eventually led, through phone records and a process I still don't fully understand, back to Dale. How much? I said. She told me. I stared at the glove compartment. That can't be right, I said. It's right. For how long? The estate has been in holding for 11 years. There's been interest. I thought about the apartment I'd rented in Columbus, the one with the radiator that made noise all winter, the student loans I'd been paying down $500 at a time, the Thanksgiving dinners I'd driven to, even when I didn't want to, because I thought maybe this time Dale would be different. Maybe this time I'd feel like someone's family. What do we do? I said. It wasn't really a question. Claudette reached into the back seat and brought forward a leather portfolio. The estate attorney is in Savannah. We fly out Monday. But tonight, she looked toward the house. Tonight I'd like to have a conversation with Dale. He won't open the door. He'll open it for me. She was right. Dale opened the door in his Thanksgiving sweater, and for a moment he looked at Claudette the way people look at something they thought they'd successfully avoided. That particular shrinking, that recalculation behind the eyes. I don't believe we've met, he said. His voice was steady. I'll give him that. We haven't, Claudette said, but you know who I am. The pause that followed told me everything. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't threaten. She stood in his doorway with her coat still on and laid out, very plainly, what she knew and what she could prove and what the next several months of his life were going to look like unless he chose, right now, to cooperate with the estate process fully and without complication. I stood behind her and watched Dale's face cycle through several things. At one point, he looked at me. I think he expected something from me. Anger, or tears, or some version of the lost kid he'd been managing for 14 years. I didn't give him anything. I just looked back. He agreed to cooperate. I flew to Savannah on Monday. I'd never been. It was warm enough that I left my coat in the rental car, which after Indiana felt like a small miracle. The attorney's office was in a building near Forsyth Park, old brick, tall windows. There were documents, many documents. I signed things I didn't fully understand yet and was told I would understand them better in time. What I understood immediately was this: my father had not abandoned me. He had died young in an accident on a wet highway in October, and in the years after, the thing he'd built had kept growing, and he had left it, specifically and clearly, to me. I sat in that attorney's office and thought about being 7 years old, the age I was when he died. I thought about the story my mother had always told, carefully, gently, the way she told it, that my father had been a complicated man who loved me but couldn't stay. I wondered now how much of that she'd believed and how much she constructed, because the truth, the real truth, was something she hadn't known either. The attorney, a quiet man named Forsyth, asked if I needed a moment. I said I was fine, needed a moment. I said I was fine. I signed the next page. The process took months. It wasn't simple, and it wasn't clean, and there were times when it felt like wading through something that didn't want to give way. Dale's cooperation turned out to be limited. He was technically compliant and practically obstructive, the way certain men are when they've lost but haven't admitted it yet. His attorney sent letters. Our attorney sent letters back. There were depositions. There were moments when I sat in my apartment in Columbus and thought, this is too much. This is going to hollow me out before it's over. But Claudette called every week, not to report on progress. Her own attorney handled that, but just to check in, to ask how I was eating, to tell me about what she remembered of my father when he was young, that he'd been terrible at cooking, but insisted on doing it anyway, that he'd had a habit of buying books and never finishing them, that he'd once driven 6 hours in the wrong direction on a road trip because he refused to admit he was lost and everyone in the car had been too fond of him to say anything. I started to build a picture. Not of a complicated man who couldn't stay, of a person, specific and flawed and real, who had been moving toward me his whole life and just ran out of road before he got there. By spring, most of it was resolved. The estate assets transferred. The life insurance situation became the subject of a civil proceeding that I was advised not to discuss in detail, but the short version is that Dale's version of events did not hold up against the documentation Claudette's team had gathered, and the outcome was not favorable for him. The house, my mother's house, the one she'd owned before Dale, the one that had been mortgaged out from under her, was part of the settlement. He had to sell it. I didn't want it. I told the attorney to make sure the proceeds went to Lily. Lily called me when she found out. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know. She was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry I didn't do more. When Mom was sick. After. I kept thinking if I just kept the peace. You were surviving, I said. That's different from doing nothing. She was quiet again. Then, are you happy? I mean, is this making you happy? I thought about that. The honest answer was that happy wasn't quite the right word yet. What I felt was more like solid, like I was standing on something real for the first time in a long time. The ground beneath me had a new quality. It held. Getting there, I said. I moved to Savannah in July. I'd never planned to. But after all those trips to the attorney's office, after walking through that city with Spanish moss overhead and the smell of something salt and green in the air, I kept thinking about it. Claudette had a life there. She knew people. There was a community that had known my father, known his family, known the part of my history I'd been missing. I got an apartment near the water. Nothing spectacular. I wanted to earn spectacular slowly, on my own terms. On my first full day there, Claudette took me to a restaurant her family had gone to for 40 years. A small place with wooden tables and no decor except for an old jukebox that nobody ever seemed to actually use. We ate shrimp and grits, and she told me more stories about my father, and I told her about Columbus, about the radiator that clanked all winter, about the Thanksgivings I'd driven to trying to feel like I belonged somewhere. You belong somewhere, she said. I'm starting to think that, I said. On the way home, I walked through Forsyth Park. The fountain was going. A couple of kids were chasing each other around a bench. An older man was reading a newspaper, actually reading a physical newspaper in the afternoon sun. I sat down on a bench and I thought about my mother. I thought about her writing Claudette's name and number on that piece of paper, folding it, putting it in a box with a dentist reminder and a dry cleaning slip. I thought about how she couldn't hand it to me directly, couldn't say, call this woman if things get bad, because to say that would be to admit that things might get bad, and she was trying to protect me from that knowledge right up until the end. She protected me with that piece of paper in the most impractical, uncertain, hopeful way possible. I sat there until the afternoon went gold and then blue, and the kids went home and the man with the newspaper folded it under his arm and walked away. Then I got up. There was a lot I still didn't know. There was a lot to learn and rebuild and figure out. There were phone calls I hadn't made yet and rooms in my history I hadn't opened. But I had time now. Real time, mine, not borrowed. I walked home through the warm Georgia evening thinking about my father driving 6 hours in the wrong direction and refusing to admit he was lost, and everyone in the car loving him anyway. And I thought, I come from that. Some of that stubborn, ridiculous, tender thing is in me. I can work with that. I've thought a lot about the piece of paper my mother left in that box. Not the will, not the insurance policy, not any of the legal documents that ended up mattering so much. Just that folded piece of paper with Claudette's number on it, tucked between a dentist reminder and a dry cleaning slip like it was nothing. Like it was ordinary. She couldn't say it out loud. She couldn't hand it to me and say, when things fall apart, call this woman, because saying that would mean admitting she knew things were going to fall apart, and she was trying, right up to the end, to protect me from that weight. So she left it the only way she could, quietly, in a box, hoping I'd find it and understand. I think about what it takes to do something like that, to be that sick, that tired, that afraid, and still be thinking about someone else, still be making small, careful moves for a future you won't be around to see. That's not weakness. That's a particular kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. It just acts and trusts and lets go. Dale made different choices. I don't think he was born without a conscience. I don't think it works that way. I think he made one small dishonest choice, and then another to protect the first, and then another, and somewhere in there he stopped being able to tell the difference between what he'd earned and what he'd taken. That's the thing about that kind of slow moral erosion. It doesn't feel like erosion from the inside. It feels like adaptation. It feels like survival. By the time he threw me out in the cold for asking one question, I think he genuinely believed he was in the right. That's what years of unchecked choices can do to a person's ability to see clearly. I'm not saying that to excuse him. I'm saying it because I think it's important to understand for my own sake how a person gets there, so I can recognize the smaller versions of those choices in myself. The moments when it would be easier to take something that isn't mine, to stay quiet when I should speak, to let someone else carry a cost I should own. Those moments exist for everyone. What you do with them is what you actually are. What I keep coming back to, though, is the intelligence of patience. Claudette waited. The estate waited. The truth waited. None of it dissolved just because Dale tried to bury it. The facts of my father's life, who he was, what he built, what he intended, survived every attempt to erase them. Not because of any dramatic intervention, just because true things tend to persist. They don't require maintenance the way lies do. I didn't do anything heroic. I asked a question at a dinner table and got thrown out into the cold. I sat on a concrete step with a moving blanket. I called a number on a piece of paper. That's the whole story, really. The rest was already in motion before I knew it existed. If there's anything I'd say to someone standing in their own version of that driveway, coatless, angry, not sure what comes next, it's just this. The question you asked that got you thrown out was probably the right question. The discomfort you're sitting in right now is not evidence that you were wrong. Sometimes the truth costs you warmth before it gives you anything back. Stay in the cold a little longer if you have to. Make the call.